Sometimes the moment you think your marriage is finally being saved is the moment you realize it's already been replaced. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 68 years old, and until last spring I believed I understood the man I had been married to for 42 years. His name is David Lawson, and for most of our lives together, he was the kind of man neighbors trusted and friends admired. He coached Little League when our son was young. He fixed broken fences for people on our street in Columbus, Ohio, and every Sunday morning he brewed coffee before I even woke up. That was the man I thought I married. So when things between us started feeling distant over the last couple of years, I convinced myself it was just age or routine, or the quiet way long marriages sometimes settle into silence. We still lived in the same house, ate dinner at the same kitchen table, watched the same evening news, but there was a space between us that hadn't always been there. Conversations became shorter. His phone seemed to buzz more often. Some nights he'd step out onto the porch to take calls he said were about old work contacts. I tried not to question it. After 4 decades of marriage, you don't want to believe suspicion belongs in your home. Then one evening in early May, while we were clearing the dishes, David surprised me. He leaned against the counter, dried his hands with a dish towel, and said something I hadn't expected to hear in years. He said, "Maggie, I think we should take a trip. Just the two of us. Get away for a while. Fix things between us." I remember the exact way the kitchen light reflected off the sink when he said it. For a moment, my heart felt 20 years younger. Because when someone you've loved for most of your life finally says they want to try again, you want to believe them. I asked where he wanted to go, expecting somewhere familiar like Florida or maybe the Smoky Mountains. But he shook his head and said he had something different in mind. A small town in Arizona. Quiet, peaceful, somewhere we could talk without distractions. I laughed a little because Arizona felt so far from Ohio it might as well have been another world, but he smiled in that reassuring way he always had and said the dry air and red rock landscapes were supposed to be beautiful that time of year. A fresh start, he called it. I should tell you something about long marriages. When you've been with someone for 42 years, the idea of a fresh start is powerful. It feels like turning back the clock to when you were younger, when the future still stretched out wide and open in front of you. So I said yes. Within a week he had booked the flights, reserved a small boutique hotel in a town I'd never heard of before, and planned what he described as a quiet, relaxing escape for the two of us. The day we left, the Ohio sky was gray and cool, but David seemed almost eager, like a man excited about a secret surprise. At the airport, he carried both our bags and insisted I take the window seat on the plane. He even reached over and held my hand during takeoff, something he hadn't done in years. I remember thinking maybe this trip really would help us find our way back to each other. After nearly 4 hours in the air and another hour driving through wide desert roads, we arrived in the little Arizona town where he had booked the hotel. The place was smaller than I expected, the kind of town where you could drive from one end to the other in 10 minutes, surrounded by dusty hills and long quiet streets lined with low houses and cactus plants. The hotel itself was charming in a simple way, with adobe-colored walls and a courtyard full of desert flowers. But almost immediately something felt strange, though I couldn't explain why. As David checked us in, I noticed how easily he navigated the lobby, like someone who had been there before. When we stepped outside afterward, he didn't hesitate about which street led toward the restaurants or which direction the town center was. "You seem to know your way around," I joked lightly. He shrugged and said he'd done a lot of research online before booking the trip. It sounded reasonable enough, yet the feeling stayed with me. That first evening we walked through the quiet streets while the sun set behind the red hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Couples passed us on the sidewalks, and somewhere, a live guitar played from a restaurant patio. It should have been romantic. It should have felt like the beginning of something hopeful. But as we walked, I noticed David kept glancing around, not like a tourist admiring a new place, but like someone checking his surroundings. Once or twice he slowed his pace near certain streets as if recognizing them. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, this trip was supposed to fix our marriage. That's what he said. And when you've spent 42 years trusting someone, your instinct isn't to question the gift they're offering you. Your instinct is to believe it. I didn't know then that the quiet little town we had just arrived in wasn't new to David at all. I didn't know that somewhere just a few streets away was a place connected to him in a way that would change everything I thought I knew about my husband. And I definitely didn't know that before this trip was over, a single piece of paper left by a complete stranger would open a door into a life I had never even imagined existed. The next morning I woke up earlier than David, something that rarely happened during our normal life back in Columbus. The sunlight in Arizona felt different from the soft gray mornings I was used to in Ohio. It was brighter, almost golden, slipping through the thin curtains of the hotel room and stretching across the floor like warm ribbons. For a few quiet minutes, I simply lay there listening. The small town outside our window was already waking up. Somewhere in the distance a truck rolled slowly down the road, and I could hear birds I did not recognize calling from the desert trees. It should have felt peaceful, the kind of calm morning couples imagine when they talk about taking a trip to reconnect. But as I turned my head toward the other side of the bed, I noticed David was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window with his phone in his hand. The glow from the screen lit up his face in a way that made him look almost tense. When he realized I was watching him, he quickly locked the phone and forced a small smile. He asked if I had slept well. I told him that I had, and for a moment we both pretended that everything felt normal. He suggested we walk into town for breakfast, saying there was a cafe just a few blocks away that people online had recommended. Again, I noticed the same strange confidence in the way he spoke about the town, as if he already knew where things were instead of discovering them with me. We left the hotel around 8 in the morning and stepped into the dry desert air. The streets were quiet except for a few locals opening their shops. Small art galleries and gift stores lined the sidewalks, their windows filled with pottery, turquoise jewelry, and paintings of the red rock hills that surrounded the town. As we walked, David moved easily from corner to corner without pausing to check directions. Twice he turned down streets before even looking at the signs. I asked if he had studied a map before the trip, trying to keep my voice light, and he laughed softly and said he just had a good sense of direction. That answer sounded harmless enough, but something about it stayed in the back of my mind. We reached the cafe he mentioned, a cozy place with wooden tables outside and the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the open door. The sign above the entrance read Desert Bloom Cafe, and a few early customers were already sitting on the patio. David chose a table near the sidewalk and ordered us coffee and breakfast burritos. While we waited for the food, I noticed him glancing down the street several times, not in a casual, curious way, but like someone expecting to see a familiar face appear around the corner. When I asked what he was looking at, he quickly said he was just admiring the view of the hills beyond the rooftops. I followed his gaze, but all I could see were quiet buildings and the pale blue sky stretching above them. Our food arrived, and we began talking about ordinary things, the kind of gentle conversation couples have when they're trying to rebuild comfort. We talked about our grandson back in Ohio, about whether we might visit him this summer, about the possibility of selling the old boat we had not used in years. David listened politely, but I noticed his attention drifting again and again to his phone resting beside his coffee cup. At one point it vibrated softly, and he flipped it over so quickly that it almost tipped his drink. He said it was probably just a spam call and slipped the phone into his pocket. I tried to push away the small knot forming in my chest. After all, we were on this trip to repair our marriage, not to search for problems that might not even exist. Still, the longer we sat there, the more I sensed that invisible distance between us that had followed us all the way from Ohio to this quiet Arizona town. A few minutes later, something else caught my attention. Across the street, standing near a small bookstore, there was a woman who seemed to be looking directly at our table. She was probably in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back and sunglasses resting on top of her head. At first I assumed she was simply waiting for someone or reading a message on her phone. But every time I glanced up, her eyes returned to us. Not just casually observing, but studying us in a way that felt deliberate. I mentioned it quietly to David, expecting him to turn and look, but instead he stiffened slightly and kept his gaze fixed on his plate. He said I was probably imagining things, and that tourists often stared at people they thought they recognized. His answer felt rushed, like he wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible. Eventually the woman disappeared down the sidewalk, and I told myself the moment had been nothing more than an odd coincidence. After breakfast, David suggested we walk a little farther through town before returning to the hotel. The streets were beginning to fill with more visitors now, and the morning sun had climbed high enough to warm the sidewalks. We passed a small park with wooden benches and a fountain shaped like a desert flower. As we reached the corner of the park, I felt that strange sensation again, the feeling of being watched. I turned my head and saw the same woman from earlier walking toward us from the opposite direction. This time she slowed as she approached our path. For a second our eyes met, and there was something in her expression that I still cannot fully explain. It was not anger, and it was not fear. It was more like quiet determination, as though she had already made up her mind about something important. As she passed our bench, she did not say a word. She did not even look directly at David. Instead, she placed a folded piece of paper beside my hand on the wooden bench, so smoothly that anyone else walking by might have thought it was an accident. Then she continued down the path without turning back. For several seconds, I simply stared at the small folded paper resting on the bench beside me. David had not noticed it yet. My heart began beating faster, not because I understood what was happening, but because something deep inside me suddenly felt certain that whatever was written on that piece of paper was going to change the direction of this entire trip. For a moment I did not move. The small folded piece of paper sat on the wooden bench beside my hand, no bigger than a restaurant receipt, but it suddenly felt heavier than anything I had touched that morning. David was still looking across the park, completely unaware that the woman who had passed us had left something behind. I glanced in the direction she had walked, but she was already halfway down the path, blending into the slow movement of visitors strolling beneath the desert sun. My fingers hovered above the paper as if touching it might trigger something I was not ready to face. Finally, I picked it up and slipped it quietly into my palm. David turned back toward me just then and asked if I was ready to head back toward the hotel. I nodded and forced a small smile, pretending nothing unusual had happened. The folded paper remained hidden in my hand as we stood up from the bench and began walking again through the park. Every step back toward the street felt strangely louder than the last. My mind kept returning to the expression on the woman's face when she had left the note. There had been no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty. It was the calm action of someone who believed she was doing exactly the right thing. We crossed the street and continued down the sidewalk toward the hotel, passing art galleries and souvenir shops that displayed bright pottery in their windows. David talked casually about finding a hiking trail later that afternoon, mentioning a scenic overlook about 2 miles outside of town that he had read about online. As he spoke, I realized something that made the quiet tension in my chest grow stronger. This was the third time since arriving that he had mentioned a place before we even saw a map or a sign pointing to it. It was as if the town already existed clearly in his memory. I answered his questions with polite nods, but my attention was focused entirely on the folded paper in my hand. The paper felt warm now from being held so tightly in my palm. I kept wondering what kind of message someone would risk passing to a complete stranger in a public park. When we reached the hotel courtyard, David suggested we sit for a few minutes before going upstairs. There was a small fountain in the center of the courtyard surrounded by low stone benches, and the sound of water echoed gently against the adobe walls. We sat down, and he began talking about calling a tour company to schedule a jeep ride through the Red Rock Hills the next day. While he spoke, his phone vibrated again in his pocket. I saw the movement clearly this time. His hand instinctively reached toward the phone, but then he hesitated and glanced at me before leaving it where it was. The hesitation lasted only a second, yet it was enough to remind me of the folded paper still hidden in my hand. I excused myself and said I wanted to grab a bottle of water from the vending machine inside the lobby. David nodded and continued looking at the small map brochure he had picked up from the hotel desk earlier. As soon as I stepped inside the quiet hallway leading to the lobby, I stopped beside a tall potted plant where no one else could see me clearly. My heart was beating faster than it should have for such a simple moment. Slowly I unfolded the piece of paper. The message written on it was short, only a few words printed in neat handwriting with a black pen. It said, "Your husband lives here." Under the sentence was another line that read Juniper Lane House 214. I stared at the words for several seconds, waiting for them to make sense. Your husband lives here. The sentence repeated in my mind like an echo bouncing off empty walls. At first I wondered if the note had been meant for someone else, some other woman sitting at the cafe earlier, someone whose husband actually belonged to this town. But the woman had walked directly to me in the park. She had placed the paper beside my hand without hesitation. She had looked straight into my eyes as if she knew exactly who I was. A strange chill moved through my chest, even though the Arizona air outside was warm and dry. Juniper Lane House 214. I had never heard David mention Juniper Lane. I did not even know if it was a real street in this town. Yet the message felt too deliberate to dismiss as a misunderstanding. I folded the paper again and slipped it into my purse just as another couple entered the lobby behind me. For a moment, I considered walking straight back outside and showing the note to David, demanding an explanation. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of the way he had stiffened earlier when I mentioned the woman watching us at breakfast. Maybe it was the uneasy feeling that had followed me since we first arrived in town. Whatever the reason, I suddenly realized that confronting him immediately might close the door to answers I did not yet have. Instead, I walked to the vending machine, bought a bottle of water, and returned to the courtyard where David was still studying the small map brochure. He looked up and smiled as if nothing unusual had happened that morning. I sat beside him and listened while he pointed to different locations around the town, describing where we might go later that afternoon. As he spoke, my mind was no longer focused on the hiking trail he was recommending or the scenic views he promised we would see. My thoughts were fixed on a single sentence written on a folded piece of paper, now resting quietly inside my purse. Your husband lives here. For the first time since arriving in this quiet Arizona town, I began to wonder if the trip David had planned so carefully was not meant to save our marriage at all, but to hide something that had been waiting here long before I ever stepped onto that plane. The rest of that afternoon passed in a strange fog of polite conversation and quiet observation. I sat beside David in the hotel courtyard, while he talked about hiking trails and scenic overlooks, but my thoughts kept circling back to the folded paper inside my purse. Your husband lives here. Juniper Lane House 214. The words echoed again and again in my mind, refusing to settle into something harmless or easy to explain away. I told myself that the note might be a mistake, that perhaps the woman had confused me with someone else, yet every time I glanced at David, another small detail made that explanation feel weaker. The way he held the town map was the first thing I noticed. He was not studying it the way tourists usually do, slowly tracing streets with their fingers as they try to understand where they are. Instead, he flipped the brochure open briefly and then folded it again as if he only needed to pretend he was checking it. When he suggested we walk to a small ice cream shop 2 blocks away, he stood up and headed in the exact direction without even glancing at the map again. I followed him through the courtyard and onto the sidewalk, watching the confident rhythm of his steps as we turned corners through streets that were still unfamiliar to me. Every few minutes he pointed out a shop or a restaurant and said he had read about it before the trip. Normally I would have believed that explanation without hesitation, but the note inside my purse had changed the way I heard every word he spoke. By the time we reached the ice cream shop, the afternoon sun had grown strong enough that the sidewalk felt warm even through the soles of my shoes. We ordered 2 small cups of vanilla ice cream and sat at a table outside beneath a striped umbrella. Families and couples moved slowly along the street, stopping to take photos of the red rock hills rising in the distance. From the outside, our afternoon probably looked like a peaceful vacation moment between an older married couple. David even reached across the table once and squeezed my hand, asking if I was enjoying the trip so far. I smiled and told him the town was beautiful. The truth was that I had begun noticing something else about his behavior that I could not ignore. Every time a car passed on the street or someone new walked out of a nearby shop, David glanced up quickly as if checking whether he recognized them. It was a small motion, but it repeated often enough that it felt deliberate. After a few minutes, his phone vibrated again in his pocket. This time he stood up and stepped a few feet away from the table before answering it. I could not hear the full conversation, but I noticed how his voice dropped lower, almost cautious, and how he turned slightly, so his back faced me while he spoke. When he returned, he said it had been a wrong number. I nodded quietly, even though the explanation felt thinner with every passing hour. We finished our ice cream and began walking back toward the hotel just as the afternoon heat started to soften. The desert sky above us had shifted to a pale golden color, the kind that usually makes people pause to admire a sunset. As we walked, I found myself studying the street signs we passed, searching for the name that had been written on that folded piece of paper. Juniper Lane. I told myself that if I saw the street name somewhere nearby, it might help me understand whether the note meant anything at all. But every sign we passed carried different names I had never heard before. Oak Ridge Drive, Mesa Street, Painted Canyon Road. None of them matched the address inside my purse. When we reached the hotel, David suggested we rest for a while before dinner. He said he wanted to take a short walk alone to stretch his legs while I relaxed in the room. The request might have sounded harmless under normal circumstances, but after everything that had happened that day, it immediately sharpened my attention. I asked casually how long he planned to be gone. He said maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, just enough time to clear his head before we went out again later. I watched him leave the room and walk down the hallway with an easy confidence that suddenly looked very different to me than it had the day before. The moment the door closed behind him, I reached into my purse and unfolded the paper again. The message looked exactly the same as it had earlier that afternoon, calm and direct, as if the person who wrote it had no doubt about what they were telling me. Your husband lives here. Juniper Lane. House 214. I sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes, staring at the words while the quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Finally, I stood up and walked to the window. From the second floor, I could see part of the street below the hotel entrance. After about 10 minutes, David appeared outside. Instead of turning left toward the restaurants we had visited earlier, he turned right and began walking quickly toward the far end of the street without looking back. Something inside me shifted in that moment. It was not anger, and it was not panic. It was a quiet decision forming with surprising clarity. I picked up the small town map he had left on the table and began scanning the grid of streets printed across it. It took less than a minute before my eyes found the name I had been searching for. Juniper Lane was not far from the hotel at all. According to the map, it was only 3 blocks away, running parallel to the park where the woman had handed me the note. I folded the map slowly and slipped the piece of paper back into my purse. For the first time since arriving in this town, I realized that the answer to the strange message might not require guessing or imagining anything at all. The address was real. The street was real. And somewhere on that quiet road was a house with the number 214 waiting to reveal whether the stranger who approached me in the park had told the truth or whether my mind had been chasing a story that did not exist. I waited nearly 20 minutes before leaving the hotel room. Part of me told myself I was being foolish, that I was chasing a rumor written on a scrap of paper by a stranger whose motives I did not understand. But another part of me, a quieter and more patient part that had spent 42 years learning how to read the small signals in my husband's behavior, kept reminding me how easily David had navigated this town since the moment we arrived. I picked up my purse, checked once more that the folded note was still inside, and then stepped into the hallway. The corridor outside our room was silent except for the distant hum of the elevator. As the doors closed behind me in the lobby, I noticed how different the evening air felt compared to the bright heat of the afternoon. The sun had begun lowering behind the red hills, casting long shadows across the streets. According to the map David had left on the table, Juniper Lane was only 3 blocks away. That distance sounded small when I first read it, but as I walked through the unfamiliar streets it felt longer than I expected. Each corner I turned carried the strange weight of possibility. What if the note meant nothing, and I arrived at a quiet house belonging to someone who had never heard of David Lawson? What if the stranger had mistaken me for another woman entirely? Those explanations still floated through my mind, yet something about the calm certainty in that woman's eyes when she placed the paper beside my hand kept pushing me forward. The sidewalks were mostly quiet now, with only a few couples strolling toward restaurants as the evening lights began flickering on inside storefront windows. I passed the small park again where the note had been given to me earlier that day. For a moment, I slowed near the same wooden bench where David and I had been sitting that morning. The place looked ordinary and peaceful, the fountain still sending a soft arc of water into the basin below. Nothing about it suggested that a moment there had quietly shifted the direction of my entire trip. I continued walking until the street signs changed again. Mesa Street ended at a corner marked by a simple green sign that read Juniper Lane. My steps slowed automatically as I turned onto the narrow road. Juniper Lane looked quieter than the other streets in town, lined with small single-story houses painted in warm desert colors. Low fences surrounded neat yards filled with cactus plants, gravel paths, and a few desert flowers that glowed softly in the fading sunlight. It was the kind of peaceful residential street where children probably rode bicycles in the afternoon and neighbors greeted each other over garden fences. Nothing about it looked mysterious or threatening. Yet my heart was beating faster with every house number I passed. 202, 206, 210. The numbers were painted neatly on mailboxes and small wooden posts near the driveways. When I reached the next house, I stopped. Walking. The mailbox near the curb read 214 in simple black lettering. I stood there for several seconds, suddenly aware of how quiet the street had become. The house itself was modest, but well cared for. Pale tan walls reflected the last light of the evening sun, and a small porch light had already been switched on beside the front door. In the yard, there was a wooden swing hanging from a metal frame and a few bright toys scattered near the walkway. I felt a strange tightening in my chest when I saw those toys, because they suggested something I had not expected. Children lived here. I stepped a little closer to the sidewalk across from the house, careful not to look like someone who was studying the place too closely. From where I stood, I could see through the large front window into the living room. A soft lamp illuminated the space inside. On the far wall, there were several framed photographs arranged in a neat row. I could not see the details clearly from that distance, but the shapes looked like family pictures, the kind people display proudly in their homes. For a moment, I considered turning around and walking back to the hotel before anyone inside noticed me. If the note had been wrong, then I would be standing here like a stranger staring into someone else's home. But just as I took a step backward, movement appeared inside the house. A woman walked into the living room carrying a small basket of folded laundry. She looked to be somewhere in her late 30s or early 40s with light brown hair tied loosely behind her head. She set the basket on the couch and began sorting the clothes with the easy rhythm of someone finishing an ordinary evening routine. I watched for only a few seconds before forcing myself to look away. Staring through someone's window felt wrong no matter what reason had brought me here. I turned slightly toward the street again and noticed something else that made my breath pause. Parked along the curb just 2 houses down was a dark gray sedan that looked very familiar. The shape of the headlights and the small scratch near the rear bumper were details I recognized immediately because I had seen them countless times before. It was the same model car David had rented. When we arrived at the airport yesterday afternoon, my mind raced to find a logical explanation. Perhaps another tourist had rented the same type of car from the same company. That was possible, but the small scratch near the bumper was in the exact same place I remembered noticing earlier when David loaded our suitcases into the trunk. I took a slow breath and forced myself to remain calm. There was still one more detail I needed to confirm before jumping to conclusions. I walked a little farther down the sidewalk, pretending to check something inside my purse while my eyes quietly examined the license plate on the parked car. The numbers matched the ones printed on the rental agreement folded inside David's travel folder back at the hotel. At that moment, the front door of the house behind me opened with the soft creak of hinges. A small boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, ran out onto the porch holding a toy airplane. He laughed as he lifted the plane above his head and made the sound of an engine while circling the small yard. Then he called out toward the open doorway in a cheerful voice that carried clearly through the evening air. He said, "Mom, when is Dad coming home?" The little boy's voice echoed across the quiet street with an innocent clarity that made the air around me feel suddenly heavier. "Mom, when is Dad coming home?" The words hung there for a moment, as if the evening itself had paused to listen. From inside the house, the woman's voice answered calmly, telling him that Dad would be home soon and that he should not run too far from the yard. Her tone carried the relaxed patience of someone who had repeated that sentence many times before. I stood on the sidewalk pretending to check something inside my purse, but in reality, I was trying to steady the sudden rush of thoughts moving through my mind. A child asking when his father would come home was not unusual, but the car parked down the street with the exact same scratch on the bumper as David's rental vehicle made the moment feel far from ordinary. The boy continued running small circles across the yard with the toy airplane lifted above his head. The fading sunlight caught the plastic wings as he laughed softly to himself, making the quiet humming sound of an engine. I watched him for only a few seconds before forcing myself to look away again. Something about the scene felt deeply personal, and I had the uncomfortable sense that I was standing too close to a life that did not belong to me. Yet the message written on the folded paper inside my purse kept repeating in my mind. "Your husband lives here." I tried once more to imagine an explanation that would make everything simple again. Perhaps the car truly did belong to someone else who had rented the same model from the same company. Perhaps the child's father worked somewhere nearby, and the connection I was imagining existed only inside my own worried thoughts. Those possibilities sounded reasonable, but the strange confidence David had shown navigating this town since the moment we arrived made them difficult to believe. I decided to walk slowly past the house instead of standing in one place any longer. If anyone inside noticed me watching their home too carefully, it would be difficult to explain why I was there. As I moved along the sidewalk, I kept my gaze forward, but the large front window remained visible in the corner of my vision. The living room light illuminated several framed photographs on the wall. For just a brief moment, I allowed my eyes to turn slightly toward the glass. One of the pictures appeared larger than the others and showed what looked like a family standing together outdoors. I could not see the details clearly from the sidewalk, but the shape of the man in the photograph made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore. His shoulders looked familiar. The posture looked familiar. I quickly looked away before my imagination carried the thought any further. The boy in the yard noticed me passing the house and lifted his airplane slightly higher as if showing it off to a stranger walking by. I smiled politely and continued toward the end of the street, reminding myself that a single glance through a window was not proof of anything. When I reached the corner of Juniper Lane, I stopped beside a small tree and pretended to read a notice posted on a wooden community board. From that position, I could still see the dark gray rental car parked 2 houses away. I waited there quietly for several minutes, unsure of what I was expecting to happen. The evening sky deepened into soft shades of purple and orange while porch lights along the street flickered on one by one. Families began closing their front doors and preparing for dinner. The boy with the airplane eventually returned inside his house after his mother called his name again. Just when I began thinking that nothing else would happen, I heard the distant sound of footsteps approaching from the far end of the block behind me. At first it was only the steady rhythm of someone walking along the sidewalk. Then the sound grew clearer. My body reacted before my mind fully understood why. I turned my head slowly toward the direction of the approaching steps. A man was walking along the street carrying what looked like a small grocery bag in one hand. The streetlights had just begun turning on, casting long shadows across the pavement, and for a moment his face remained partially hidden by the dim light. But his walk was unmistakable. I had watched that same easy stride for more than 4 decades of marriage. Every movement of his shoulders, every quiet shift in his posture, belonged to someone I knew better than almost anyone in the world. It was David. My husband walked calmly down Juniper Lane as if this street had been part of his daily routine for years. He did not look surprised to be there. He did not pause to check directions. Instead, he moved directly toward the house with the number 214. I remained standing near the corner, hidden partly by the shadow of the small tree, my heart beating so loudly that I wondered if the sound might carry across the quiet street. David stepped onto the walkway leading to the front door. The porch light illuminated his face clearly now, leaving no room for doubt about what I was seeing. Before he could even reach the door, it swung open from the inside. The woman I had seen earlier appeared on the porch with a gentle smile, as if she had been expecting him. The little boy ran past her legs and wrapped his arms around David's waist with excited energy, shouting, "Dad, you are finally home." David bent down immediately and lifted the boy into his arms with the comfortable ease of a father greeting his child after a long day. Then he stepped inside the house, and the door closed behind them, leaving the quiet street exactly as peaceful as it had been before, except now I understood that the stranger's note had not been a warning about something that might happen in the future. It had been a simple description of something that was already real. For several seconds I did not move at all. My body remained beside the small tree at the corner of Juniper Lane while my mind tried to catch up with what my eyes had just seen. The front door of the house with the number 214 had closed quietly behind David, and the soft porch light continued glowing above the entrance as if nothing unusual had happened. The street itself remained peaceful. A faint evening breeze moved through the desert plants in the yards, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Everything looked exactly the same as it had only minutes earlier, yet the meaning of that quiet street had completely changed. My husband had just walked into that house like he belonged there. The little boy had run into his arms without hesitation, and the woman who opened the door had greeted him with the calm familiarity of someone welcoming a man home. I stood there trying to breathe slowly, reminding myself not to react too quickly. 42 years of marriage teaches a person many things, but one of the most important lessons is that sudden emotions rarely lead to clear decisions. Instead of rushing toward the house or knocking on the door, I forced myself to remain where I was and think carefully about what I had witnessed. There had been no confusion about the man who walked up that path. It was David. The same relaxed walk, the same way he shifted the grocery bag from one hand to the other before bending down to lift the child. Those details belonged to the man I had shared my life with for more than 4 decades. Yet what I had just seen did not look like a random visit or an unexpected meeting. It looked like a routine moment in an ordinary family evening. I waited another minute before slowly stepping away from the corner and continuing down the street as if I were simply a neighbor passing through. As I moved farther along the sidewalk, I allowed myself one brief glance back toward the house. Through the living room window, I could now see 3 figures inside the softly lit space. The boy was standing near the couch holding the toy airplane again. The woman had placed the laundry basket on a chair and was speaking to David while he set the grocery bag on the kitchen counter visible through the open doorway. Their movements looked natural and comfortable, the quiet rhythm of people who had repeated the same routine many times before. That simple image made something inside me settle into a calm understanding that felt almost heavier than anger. This was not a sudden mistake. This was a life that had been built carefully and quietly somewhere far away from the home David and I shared in Ohio. I continued walking until I reached the end of Juniper Lane and turned onto the main road again. The evening lights of the town had fully come alive now, and restaurants along the street were filling with visitors enjoying dinner beneath warm outdoor lamps. To anyone watching me pass through the crowd, I probably looked like an older woman returning from a peaceful walk. But inside my mind, the pieces of the day were rearranging themselves into a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The note from the stranger. David knowing every corner of the town without checking a map. The rental car parked down the street from that house. The boy calling him Dad with absolute certainty. By the time I reached the hotel again, the desert sky had turned deep blue and the first stars were beginning to appear above the distant hills. I stepped into the quiet lobby and rode the elevator back to our room, noticing that my hands were steady even though my thoughts were moving quickly. When I opened the door, the room was empty. David had not returned yet. I placed my purse on the small table near the window and sat down on the edge of the bed, replaying the moment I had watched him walk into that house. After a few minutes, I stood and walked to the window again. From the second floor, I could see the street below where cars passed slowly toward the restaurants and small shops. Somewhere beyond those buildings was Juniper Lane and the house where my husband had just been welcomed home by another family. The realization felt strangely quiet inside my mind. There were no raised voices and no dramatic thoughts racing through my head. Instead, there was only a steady understanding forming piece by piece. David had not brought me to this town to repair our marriage. He had brought me here because he believed he could manage both parts of his life without either one colliding with the other. Perhaps he thought a short vacation would keep me satisfied while he continued the routine he had built here over time. Perhaps he believed I would never wander far enough through the town to discover the truth waiting just a few blocks away. I picked up the folded note from my purse and placed it on the table in front of me. Your husband lives here. The stranger who wrote that message had not exaggerated or hinted at something uncertain. She had simply described a fact. I sat there quietly until the sound of footsteps finally approached the door about 30 minutes later. The key turned in the lock and David stepped into the room, carrying the same relaxed expression he had worn when he left earlier. He smiled and asked if I had enjoyed my walk through town while he had been out stretching his legs. I looked at him for a moment, noticing how easily the words left his mouth, and realized that whatever conversation we would eventually have about Juniper Lane did not need to happen tonight. Because now that I had seen the truth with my own eyes, I understood something important. The man standing in front of me believed his secret was still safe. And sometimes the most powerful response to a hidden truth is not revealing it immediately, but allowing the person who created it to continue believing the story they built is still intact. David moved around the hotel room with the comfortable ease of someone returning from an ordinary evening walk. He set his phone on the small table near the television, loosened the collar of his shirt, and asked if I felt like going out for dinner. His voice sounded relaxed, almost cheerful, the way it often did when we traveled together years ago before the quiet distance began growing between us. I watched him for a moment before answering, noticing how natural his expression looked. If I had not seen him walk into that house on Juniper Lane with my own eyes, I might have believed every word he said without hesitation. I told him that dinner sounded nice and that I would be ready in a few minutes. He nodded and stepped into the bathroom to wash his hands. The sound of running water filled the room while I stood beside the window looking out at the evening lights along the street below. A strange calm had settled inside me, replacing the confusion I felt earlier that day. It was not the calm of someone who had accepted what happened. It was the calm of someone who finally understood the shape of the truth. When David returned from the bathroom, we left the room together and walked down to the street. The air outside had cooled enough that a light breeze moved through the town, carrying the smell of grilled food and desert plants from the nearby restaurants. We chose a small place with outdoor tables and warm yellow lights hanging above the patio. Couples sat around us, talking quietly, while waiters moved between tables carrying plates of food. From the outside, it looked like a peaceful evening shared by two people enjoying a vacation together. David ordered a steak and asked if I wanted the same. I chose a simple grilled chicken dish and listened while he talked about the scenic Jeep tour he wanted us to take the next morning. He described the red rock formations and the views across the desert valley as if he had already seen them before. I noticed again how easily he spoke about places in this town without checking a guide or asking the waiter for recommendations. The conversation moved smoothly enough that anyone watching us would have assumed we were a normal married couple sharing dinner. But every time David smiled across the table at me, a second image appeared in my mind. The image of him lifting that little boy into his arms on the porch of the house on Juniper Lane. At one point during dinner, his phone buzzed softly beside his plate. He glanced at the screen quickly and turned the phone face down before I could see anything. The movement was small but familiar. I had watched that same motion many times during the past year at home in Ohio. I took a sip of water and asked him casually if everything was all right. He smiled again and said it was probably just a message from the car rental company reminding him about the return date. His answer came quickly, almost too quickly, but I simply nodded and changed the subject. Instead of confronting him, I asked about the first time he visited Arizona years ago during a business trip. The question seemed harmless enough, yet it caused him to pause for a brief second before answering. He told me he had only come through the state once many years ago and had barely seen anything outside the airport. I listened quietly while he spoke, noticing the careful way he kept his story simple. The interesting thing about long marriages is that you eventually learn the difference between someone remembering a real experience and someone constructing a safe answer. David's tone carried the smooth confidence of someone repeating a line he had practiced before. After dinner, we walked slowly back toward the hotel under the soft glow of streetlights. The town had grown quieter as most visitors finished their meals and returned to their rooms. As we passed the small park where the stranger had first placed the note beside my hand, I felt a brief urge to look around for her again. Whoever she was, she had known something important about my husband long before I arrived in this town. But the park benches were empty now, and the fountain continued its gentle arc of water into the basin below. David slipped his hands into his pockets and asked if I was enjoying the trip so far. I answered that the town was beautiful and that it felt peaceful compared to the busy streets back home. That part of my answer was true. The quiet desert night carried a strange clarity that made every thought feel sharper than usual. When we reached the hotel room, David turned on the television and flipped through a few channels before settling on a late-night news program. I sat near the window again while he relaxed on the bed watching the screen. After a few minutes, he asked if I planned to join him or if I wanted to read for a while. I told him I was not tired yet and preferred to enjoy the view outside for a little longer. He accepted the answer easily and returned his attention to the television. From where I sat, I could see the reflection of the screen flickering softly across the room. The quiet hum of the air conditioner mixed with the distant sounds of cars passing on the street below. In that calm moment, I realized something important about the situation I had discovered. David believed that I knew nothing about Juniper Lane. He believed his secret life in this town remained completely separate from the marriage he shared with me in Ohio. And as I watched his relaxed reflection in the dark window glass, I understood that revealing the truth immediately would only create confusion and denial. The real answers I needed were still waiting somewhere inside the quiet house, where he had just been welcomed home, like a father and a husband. For the first time that day, I began thinking not about what I had already seen, but about what I would need to do next to understand how long that second life had been quietly growing in a place I had never even heard of until a stranger handed me a folded piece of paper in the park. That night, I did not sleep very much. David fell asleep easily beside me, the way he always had after a long day of travel, his breathing settling into a slow and steady rhythm within minutes. I lay awake staring at the ceiling while the quiet desert night moved past the window outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same moment again. The front door of the house on Juniper Lane opening, the little boy running forward with that bright voice calling out, "Dad, you are finally home," and David bending down to lift him into his arms, as if that moment had been part of his life for years. The strange thing was that the image did not bring the kind of sharp anger people often expect in situations like this. Instead, it created a deep and steady determination that grew stronger the longer I lay there thinking. If my husband had built another life only 3 blocks away from the hotel room where we were pretending to repair our marriage, then I needed to understand exactly how that second life worked. Around 2 in the morning, I quietly slipped out of bed and walked to the small desk near the window. I opened my purse and unfolded the note again, placing it carefully on the surface of the desk. "Your husband lives here. Juniper Lane House 214. The message looked simple, almost calm, as if the person who wrote it believed that once I saw the truth with my own eyes, the rest would explain itself. I picked up the hotel notepad and began writing down the pieces of information I already knew. David had chosen this town himself. He knew the streets without using a map. The rental car had been parked near that house before he walked there with groceries. A woman and a young boy clearly expected him to arrive. None of those details looked like coincidence. By the time the first pale light of morning began appearing beyond the hills outside the window, I had made a quiet decision. Instead of confronting David immediately, I would learn more about what existed on Juniper Lane. When he woke up later that morning, he seemed cheerful and energized, as if the fresh desert air had completely refreshed his mood. He suggested we have breakfast early and then take the scenic Jeep tour he mentioned the night before. I agreed easily, keeping my voice calm while we walked to a cafe 2 blocks away from the hotel. The town looked peaceful in the morning light, with shop owners opening their doors and visitors carrying cups of coffee along the sidewalks. David ordered pancakes and coffee and began talking about how beautiful the canyon views were supposed to be once we reached the higher trails. I listened and nodded, but inside my mind another plan had already taken shape. During breakfast, I casually mentioned that the dry air had given me a slight headache and that I might prefer to rest at the hotel instead of spending several hours in a Jeep on dusty roads. David looked a little disappointed at first, but he quickly adjusted his plans and said he could still take the tour alone while I relaxed. He even offered to bring back photos to show me later. His willingness to separate our plans made my decision easier. By 10 in the morning, he had left the hotel lobby to meet the Jeep tour group, waving back at me with the same friendly smile he always used when leaving for a short errand. I waited inside the lobby for another 15 minutes before stepping outside myself. The morning sun had already begun warming the quiet streets as I walked once again toward the park where the stranger had first approached me. From there, the route to Juniper Lane felt familiar now, each corner carrying the memory of the previous evening when I had followed the same path, with a completely different understanding of where it might lead. When I reached the street again, I slowed my steps, studying the houses with more careful attention than before. In daylight, the neighborhood looked even more ordinary. A man watered plants in his front yard 2 houses away while a woman loaded grocery bags into the trunk of her car farther down the street. Life moved along with the calm rhythm of a peaceful residential morning. I continued walking until the number 214 appeared again on the mailbox near the curb. The same wooden swing stood in the yard, gently moving in the light breeze. The toys from the previous evening were still scattered near the walkway. From the outside, nothing about the house suggested the complicated truth that had revealed itself there only hours earlier. As I stood on the opposite sidewalk pretending to examine the neighborhood, the front door opened again. The same woman stepped onto the porch carrying a small bag of trash, which she placed inside the outdoor bin near the fence. In daylight, I could see her more clearly. She looked younger than me by perhaps 20 years, but there was a quiet maturity in the way she moved around the yard. She paused for a moment and looked down the street, as if checking whether someone was approaching. For a second, I wondered if she might recognize me from the park the day before, but her gaze passed over the sidewalk without stopping. Then the little boy appeared beside her holding the toy airplane again. He began running small circles around the yard, just as he had the evening before. As I watched them together, a new thought formed slowly in my mind, a question that suddenly felt more important than all the others. If this woman and her child believed David belonged in their home, then they might not know that another wife existed more than 1,000 miles away in Ohio. For several minutes I remained on the sidewalk across from the house, watching the quiet rhythm of the morning unfold. The little boy continued flying his toy airplane through the air, while the woman adjusted a small flower pot near the porch steps. Nothing about their behavior suggested secrecy or tension. They looked like an ordinary family beginning another normal day. That simple truth made the situation feel even more complicated than I expected. If David had built another life here, it did not appear to be hidden from them. The child clearly believed he belonged there. The woman moved through the yard with the relaxed confidence of someone who expected her partner to return later in the day. I lowered my eyes for a moment, thinking carefully about what that might mean. A man cannot live two separate lives unless both sides of that life remain unaware of the other. Either this woman knew about me and accepted the arrangement, which seemed unlikely, or she believed David belonged entirely to her. The second possibility felt far more realistic, and it changed the direction of my thoughts immediately. If she believed that house was the center of David's world, then she had probably never heard my name before. I took a slow breath and crossed the street. The gravel under my shoes made a soft crunching sound as I approached the small fence surrounding the yard. The woman looked up when she heard my footsteps, her expression polite but curious as she noticed a stranger walking toward her gate. I stopped a few feet away so I would not appear intrusive. "Good morning," I said gently, offering the kind of calm smile people exchange with neighbors they have not met yet. She returned the greeting with the same friendly tone. The little boy paused his airplane flight and studied me for a moment before returning to his game. I asked if she had lived in the neighborhood for long, explaining that my husband and I were visiting town for a few days and that I had been enjoying quiet morning walks through the residential streets. The explanation felt natural enough that she seemed comfortable continuing the conversation. She told me her name was Rachel and that she had moved to the house about 5 years earlier. The boy in the yard was her son, Ethan, who proudly showed me the plastic airplane as if demonstrating an important invention. I knelt slightly so I could admire the toy and told him it looked like it could fly very fast. Rachel smiled at the small interaction, clearly used to her son's enthusiasm. For a moment the scene looked almost peaceful, like a neighborly conversation taking place under the warm desert sun. Then I asked the question that had brought me there. I said that while walking through town the day before I had noticed a man carrying groceries toward this street, and I wondered if it had been someone who lived nearby. Rachel's expression brightened immediately, as if she recognized the description. She said that must have been David. She explained that he sometimes stopped at the market before coming home in the evenings. The casual certainty in her voice confirmed what I had already seen with my own eyes. I kept my tone gentle and curious, as if the detail meant nothing unusual. I asked if David worked somewhere in town or if he commuted from another city. Rachel laughed softly and said his schedule could be complicated because he traveled often for business. She explained that sometimes he stayed away for several weeks at a time, but always returned to the house whenever his work trips were finished. As she spoke, I noticed how natural the story sounded to her. She did not hesitate or search for words. To Rachel, this explanation had probably made sense for years. I asked how long she and David had been together. She said they met a little over 8 years ago when he first came through Arizona on a consulting project. At that time, Ethan had only been a toddler, and David quickly became an important part of their lives. She described how he helped fix things around the house and taught Ethan how to ride a small bicycle on the driveway. Listening to her memories felt like watching pieces of a puzzle slide into place in the most unsettling way. While David had been sharing quiet dinners with me in Ohio and talking about retirement plans for the future, he had also been building another family more than 1,000 miles away. Rachel eventually asked where my husband and I were visiting from. I answered honestly that we lived in Columbus, Ohio, and that we had come to Arizona for a short vacation. She nodded politely and said she had always wanted to see the Midwest someday. The conversation might have ended there if not for the small photograph hanging beside the front door. As I turned slightly toward the porch, I could see the picture clearly in the daylight. It showed Rachel standing beside David with Ethan between them, all three smiling at the camera during what looked like a birthday celebration. My chest tightened for a moment, but I kept my expression calm. Rachel followed my gaze toward the photograph and said it was taken last year during Ethan's birthday party. David had organized a small celebration in the backyard with balloons and cake. The boy looked up proudly when she mentioned it, clearly remembering the day with excitement. In that quiet moment, I understood something important about the situation unfolding in front of me. Rachel and Ethan did not appear to be part of a secret life hidden from the world. To them, David was simply the man who came home through that door carrying groceries and stories from his travels. And the man they believed belonged to their home was the same man who slept beside me every night in Ohio. For a few seconds I stood quietly in front of the porch while Rachel spoke about the birthday party in the photograph. The warmth in her voice carried the kind of simple pride that many parents feel when they talk about small family celebrations. Ethan had already returned to flying his toy airplane across the yard, making soft engine sounds with his mouth as he ran small circles around the patch of grass. Everything about the moment looked peaceful and completely ordinary. Yet the reality behind that peaceful scene had begun to settle into my mind with a heavy clarity. The man who slept beside me every night in our home in Columbus had been celebrating birthdays here in Arizona with another family. I realized that if I walked away without saying anything, Rachel would probably continue living with the same understanding she had always believed. David would return to this house in a few days or weeks with another bag of groceries, and life would continue as if nothing had ever changed. For a moment, I considered leaving the street quietly and returning to the hotel. It would have been the easiest decision in the short term, but another thought slowly pushed that option away. Rachel had spoken to me kindly, completely unaware of the complicated truth that stood only a few feet away from her front gate. If our roles had been reversed, I would have wanted someone to tell me the truth instead of allowing the illusion to continue. I took a slow breath and looked back at her. "Rachel," I said gently, "there is something I need to ask you, and I hope you will understand that I am not trying to cause trouble." My voice remained calm, but the seriousness of the words seemed to catch her attention immediately. She stepped a little closer to the fence, her expression shifting from casual friendliness to quiet curiosity. I asked her if David had mentioned traveling to Ohio often for work. She nodded and said that many of his consulting projects were located in different parts of the country. Sometimes he spent weeks in cities she had never visited. I then asked if he had ever talked about someone named Laura. The name seemed to surprise her slightly. She paused for a moment as if searching her memory, then shook her head slowly. "No," she said, "I do not think I know anyone by that name." I could feel my heartbeat steady itself as the final piece of the truth came into focus. Rachel had never heard my name because David had never told her that I existed. I rested my hands lightly on the top of the wooden gate so I could keep my voice steady. "Rachel," I said carefully, "my name is Laura Bennett. David Bennett is my husband." The words hung quietly in the warm morning air. For several seconds Rachel did not move at all. Her eyes searched my face as if trying to understand whether she had heard me correctly. Then she gave a small confused laugh, the kind people sometimes use when they believe a stranger might be joking. "I am sorry," she said, "but David is not married. He has lived here with us for years." I nodded slowly because I had expected that response. I explained that David and I had been married for nearly 12 years, and that we owned a small house together in Columbus. I told her that we had come to Arizona for what he described as a trip, to repair our marriage. When I finished speaking, the confusion in Rachel's eyes slowly changed into something deeper and more serious. She looked toward the photograph beside the door, and then back at me again, as if comparing two different realities that refused to fit together. Ethan continued playing in the yard, unaware that the conversation near the gate had suddenly shifted the direction of three different lives. Rachel asked quietly if I was certain about the name. I reached into my purse and removed the small leather wallet that held my identification card. Without stepping closer to invade her space, I held the card up where she could see it clearly through the fence. The name Laura Bennett appeared under the photograph beside my birth date and address in Ohio. Rachel studied the card for several seconds before lowering her eyes to the ground. The silence between us felt longer than any argument could have been. Finally, she looked back up and asked a question in a voice that sounded both steady and fragile at the same time. "When did you say you were coming back to the hotel today?" I explained that David believed I was resting while he took a Jeep tour outside the town and that he would probably return to the hotel later in the afternoon. Rachel nodded slowly as if organizing a thought that had only just formed. She said that David usually came to the house in the evening after finishing whatever work he claimed to be doing in town. That meant he would likely appear here tonight expecting another normal visit with the family he believed was waiting for him. Rachel rested one hand on the wooden gate and looked directly at me with a calm determination that had not been present when we first started speaking. "If both of us have been living with different versions of the truth," she said quietly, "then perhaps it is time that David explains himself to both of us at the same time." The quiet determination in Rachel's voice remained steady as she held the gate between us. The morning sunlight had grown warmer, casting long shadows across the small yard where Ethan continued guiding his toy airplane through imaginary clouds. In that moment, the strange truth that had been hidden for years felt fully exposed under the open sky. Two different lives that David had carefully kept apart were now standing only a few feet from each other on the same street. I nodded slowly in response to Rachel's suggestion. A part of me had expected anger or disbelief after revealing who I was, but instead she had chosen something more practical. She wanted answers just as much as I did. I told her that David would probably return to the hotel around 3 or 4 in the afternoon after finishing the Jeep tour. From there, he would likely follow the same pattern he had described during breakfast, perhaps telling me he needed to run a short errand in town before dinner. Rachel listened carefully and then looked toward the photograph beside the door again. For a few seconds, she seemed to be measuring years of memories against the information I had just shared. Finally, she took a slow breath and said that if David planned to come to the house later that evening, then it would be the right moment for all three of us to be present at the same time. She explained that Ethan usually played at a neighbor's home on Friday evenings for about an hour while the adults talked. Today happened to be Friday. That small detail created a simple plan without anyone needing to say much more. I agreed that it would be better for the conversation to take place calmly without the child listening nearby. Rachel nodded and gave a small, thoughtful smile, as if acknowledging that neither of us had asked for the situation we now shared. Before leaving the gate, I thanked her for listening and for remaining calm, even after hearing something that must have felt shocking. She replied quietly that truth can feel heavy at first, but pretending it does not exist would only make the future more confusing. Those words stayed with me as I walked back toward the main street. The town looked exactly the same as it had earlier that morning. Tourists wandered between small shops while hikers prepared their backpacks near the trailhead parking lot. Yet inside my mind, the entire meaning of the trip had changed. When I reached the hotel a little after noon, I sat in the lobby with a glass of cold water and watched the front door carefully. A few hours later, David finally walked in wearing the same relaxed smile he had carried all morning. He described the Jeep tour with enthusiasm, talking about tall red rock formations and narrow trails that climbed nearly 1,000 feet above the canyon floor. I listened politely while he spoke, noticing how easily he moved through the familiar rhythm of conversation. If Rachel and I had not spoken earlier that day, I might never have known how much of his life existed beyond the stories he chose to share. After he finished describing the trip, he asked if my headache had improved. I told him that the quiet rest had helped and that I felt well enough for an evening walk before dinner. He seemed pleased with the suggestion and agreed that exploring the town at sunset would be a good way to end the day. As the sun slowly lowered behind the hills, we left the hotel together and began walking through the same streets I had traveled alone only hours earlier. David talked casually about restaurants we could try and small shops that sold handmade jewelry. I responded with calm agreement while guiding our path gradually toward the residential area near Juniper Lane. By the time the first porch lights began glowing along the sidewalks, we had reached the familiar corner. David slowed slightly when he recognized the street, though he tried to hide the reaction by pretending to study a nearby house. I continued walking until the mailbox with the number 214 came into view. The small wooden swing moved gently in the evening breeze, just as it had earlier that morning. Rachel was standing on the porch waiting quietly beside the front door. When David finally noticed her, his steps stopped completely. The surprise on his face revealed that he had never expected these two parts of his life to meet in the same place. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air felt still except for the faint sound of Ethan's laughter drifting from a neighboring yard where he was playing with friends. Rachel stepped forward first, her voice calm but clear. "David," she said, "it seems there are things you need to explain tonight." I stood beside the gate without raising my voice or moving closer. David looked from Rachel to me and then back again, as if searching for a version of reality that still made sense. But the careful separation he had maintained for years had already disappeared. Under the soft light of the porch lamp, both of his lives were standing together waiting for the truth.